Cathaoirleach, I wish to share my time with Deputy Brendan Howlin. That's agreeable. Cathaoirleach, the arrogance of Fianna Fáil knows no bounds. It's an arrogance which comes from being in government for too long. The past 14 years, you've been in government in 22 out of the last 24 years. And it is an arrogance which is expressed most eloquently by the Taoiseach himself. And we got a fine example of it earlier this morning. It says to us, doesn't matter what Fianna Fáil did, never say sorry. Never admit a mistake. It's an arrogance that says that only Fianna Fáil can rule, that the opposition is always wrong. But I felt it was brought to a new level today, because here we have a government that turned an economic boom to bust. Here we have a government that made a most calamitous mistake in how it handled the banking crisis and refused to accept that it got it wrong. Here we have a government that has presided over the worst economic crisis that this country has faced, that goes off in the final months of its life, negotiates a bad deal with the international institutions, which I suppose was fortunate that there was snow for most of the last week or 10 days, and it didn't probably get the kind of scrutiny that it might otherwise have got. Negotiates a bad deal and comes back here now today and tells us that we're all bound by it, that a new government can't change it, that it is all done and dusted, that at the same time there is no surrender or loss of sovereignty in it, and that it complies with our constitution. And it is an arrogance that has now fired the first shots of its general election campaign, which is that you want to fight it on your distorted version of what opposition parties are saying. Taoiseach, you're going to fight this election on your miserable record. Yesterday's budget was the most severe we have ever seen. But it didn't sound like that, because in his budget speech, Minister Lenihan managed to avoid announcing most of the bad news by occasionally referring to details in the accompanying budget documentation. A victory, I suppose, for tone over content. It is therefore a budget that will take, I think, some time to sink in. The Taoiseach gives the impression that the government are protecting working people from tax increases and suggesting that the Labour Party would tax them even more. Well, let's see what working people will say and how they will feel about that when they see their first pay packets in the new year, when they realise the full combined impact of the reduction in tax credits, reduction in the standard band, the loss of rent relief, the measures that will oblige working mothers to pay for benefit in kind for employer-provided childcare. The budget may have passed in the Dáil last night, but its impact will only grow with each passing week in the new year. This budget is the itemised bill for the utter failure of Fianna Fáil's economic mismanagement. It sets out who pays for the failures of a succession of Fianna Fáil finance ministers for years of utter and complete incompetence. And as usual, it is people on low and middle incomes who will pay. Who pays? Pensioners on modest incomes. When the age exemption is cut, passport fees are applied, €2,000 in extra taxes for a pensioner couple on €40,000 a year. It is families with children who pay, as child benefit is cut for another year, bringing the total cut for a family with 3 children over 2 years to €88 a month. Adding to the loss of early childhood payment. Tax credits are cut by €360 for each earner in the household, and new fees are applied for school transport. It is young people looking for work or training who pay, as their job seekers' allowance is cut. A €200 fee is applied to further education courses, and third-level fees go up again. It is the people who have lost their jobs who pay, as welfare is cut by €8 per week on top of the €8 cut last year, and there is no compensation for the loss of child benefit. It is the low-paid worker who pays, as the minimum wage will be cut, and income levies reach down to low levels of earnings. And then look at those who don't pay. The highest earners pay more PRSI, yes, but are compensated by the cut at the top rate of levies. The 7% universal charge is replacing a combined 11% health contribution and levy for the highest earners. The high-income earners in property schemes don't pay, or at least not just yet, because rather than abolish these tax breaks, they are to be phased out gently between now and 2014. The tax exiles don't pay. We're still waiting for them to fork out a single cent from the measures brought in last year's budget. In times gone by, we used to talk about the old reliables being excise duties on beer and cigarettes. Today, the old reliables are the tax breaks that Fianna Fáil continue to defend for the vested interests. This budget is based on a strategy that has already failed. It has been constructed more on injured pride than on logic, more on ideology than on common sense. It is a budget based not on sound economics, but on bad politics and failed diplomacy. This budget was written not in Ireland's interest, but in negotiations with the European Union and the IMF. It is part of what is a bad deal for Ireland. It is part of an attempt by Fianna Fáil to write not just this budget, but the next 4 budgets, and to tie the hands of the next government to their own failed strategies. But Labour will not be bound by these failures. Let us be clear as to why the government has brought in a budget that will take €6 billion, or almost 4.7% of GNP, out of the economy in a single year. The single most important decision that has brought us to this budget is the blanket bank guarantee. It was that decision that bound the Irish taxpayer to the losses of the banks, losses that were themselves the result of a property boom that was stoked by Fianna Fáil at every opportunity, and at the utter failure to regulate the banks. It was that decision, the blanket guarantee, that fundamentally undermined the creditworthiness of the Irish state and led to a catastrophic loss of confidence in Irish bonds. That was the key decision from which there was no return. It took some hard neck for the Minister to pretend yesterday that the need to seek help from the IMF, that was something that only arose in the latter half of 2010. To listen to his speech, you'd almost believe that the Irish economy met with some unfortunate accident during the summer holidays. The reason why we are here today is the direct result of the blanket guarantee and a series of profound errors before and after it. Over the 2 years that followed the blanket guarantee, Fianna Fáil failed to get a grip of the banking crisis. NAMA, the strategy that was to save us, was always a getaway car and had the effect of crystallising losses in the banking system for all the world to see. Fianna Fáil constantly overpromised to the market and underdelivered, and in doing so fundamentally undermined confidence in this country and its credit. Just as the game was up, with bond yields rising, a last-ditch attempt was made to convince investors that they should lend to the Irish state. Budget 2011, we were told, would make budget adjustments of €6 billion. This number, we were told, would impress the markets, and they would agree to lend us money at reasonable rates again. But it didn't work. No one bought the story. Markets could see the risk to growth of an adjustment of that size and shied away. The ECB's patience came to an end, and Ireland was forced to go cap in hand to the IMF and the European Union for a loan. That is the basis for the €6 billion figure. It is a number that was supposed to convince the markets and didn't. It is the number that was supposed to get the deficit in Ireland below 10% of GDP, because Minister Linehan insisted 10% was the magic number for the markets. Ireland, of course, is no longer in the market, But having conceded the 6 billion number to the European Commission, Fianna Fáil now believe that they can't back away from it. In fact, the analysis presented by the Department of Finance to the Labour Party was clearly intended to show that an adjustment of more than 4.5 billion would be self-defeating, as it would not reduce the overall quantum of adjustment needed to get the deficit down to 3% by 2014. And while the Commission continue to argue for the 6 billion adjustment, their own economic forecast shows a growth rate that is half of the government's projected growth rate and a deficit that falls short of the so-called magic number of less than 10%. The logic for the 6 billion has evaporated. The question now is this: who is the 6 billion supposed to impress? It is very interesting to compare the economic forecast of the government and that of the Commission. The Commission forecasts growth of 0.9% in GDP. It does so because it believes that exports will expand by 4.5%, imports will remain muted, and domestic demand, that is consumption and investment, will fall by 3.2%. The Commission predicts that consumption, which is worth about 50% of GDP and which is highly jobs intensive, will fall by nearly 2%. The government, on the other hand, expects exports to grow by 4.9% and that consumption will remain static in volume terms. Even though the Commission wants to stick to the 6 billion euro figure, they are not prepared to endorse the government's forecast for what the impact of a 6 billion adjustment will be on the economy. The truth, of course, is that no one knows how the economy will perform next year. Macroeconomic forecasting is at best a form of educated guesswork. Like opinion polls, macroeconomic forecasts are estimates, subject to a margin of error, although economists rarely speak of them in that way. Of course, you cannot construct a forecast that says the economy will grow by 1.7% next year after you have taken out 6 billion euro, but it comes with risks attached, and those risks are on the downside. There is a lot we don't know about how the economy will perform next year. We are in uncharted waters. Ireland has had recessions before, but none like this. Ireland has had a debt crisis before, but not one coupled with a banking crisis and an international recession. With the banking sector deleveraging and consumers still paying off debt and adding to savings, there is every reason to be concerned about how domestic demand will perform next year. In that context, in the context of uncertainty and downside risks, 6 billion euro is the wrong judgment on the scale of adjustment. Of course, we have been told, and we were told in the 4-year plan, that the key to all of this is confidence. That what Paul Krugman calls the confidence fairy is going to make all this better if we take enough medicine. Confidence is important, and it does need to be restored. But the non-Keynesian confidence effects are speculative and unpredictable, while the normal Keynesian effects of taking that much money out of the economy are far more mechanical and obvious. Equally, what should have been learned from this mess and wasn't is that restoring confidence is as much about restoring growth as it is about headline figures on deficit reduction. In the end, this is a question of judging risks, and the risks of this adjustment are too high. Because this is not an academic exercise. Ireland is not a laboratory for economists to conduct interesting experiments and write conference papers afterwards. What we are talking about here are people's jobs and their livelihoods and their homes, and whether their children will get jobs in this country and whether their grandchildren will grow up here. You don't take risks with those things. You don't take risks with people's homes because you can't own up to having made mistakes, or with people's jobs because you can't stand up to the Commission, or with the life chances of thousands of young people because you are part of a cosy ideological consensus that deep down believes that austerity is good. It isn't. It is sometimes necessary, but it has real consequences for real people in real life. That is why Labour has proposed to keep the adjustment to 4.5 billion. It is still a demanding figure, but it leaves some room for growth and employment in 2011. It leaves some room for the economy to show growth and for the Irish people to feel that we do actually have a prospect of turning the corner. Labour stood alone in this House in opposing the blanket bank guarantee. We were right. Labour opposed NAMA. We were right. And we are right in opposing this £6 billion adjustment because it is not in the national interest and because it is simply too dangerous. The sad reality is that this budget is constructed on exactly the same kind of conservative consensus that got us into this mess in the first place. The same conservative consensus that says that the market must always be free to do what it likes and that government should get out of the way. Let us be clear too, the conservative consensus has no strategy for growth. This budget has no growth strategy, and it shows a vacuum in economic thinking about how an economy like Ireland can grow in the years to come. Ireland is a small, open and flexible economy that has a proven capacity to trade successfully in world markets and in doing so to provide high and stable living standards for our people. To succeed in that objective, the role of government is not marginal, it is critical. Not in the sense of directing individual decisions about investment and production, but in the modern sense of supporting a network of institutions that support and nurture enterprise and that support and nurture people. If this crisis has taught us anything, it is that failure of regulation can be catastrophic for us all. It has also reminded us of how much we depend on each other. What we are living through is the first global crisis in global capitalism. We will get out of it, but it won't be the last recession. What matters for growth and what matters for securing the living standards of our people is that we have a growth model that combines both opportunity and security. The Conservative consensus just doesn't get that. They persist in the notion that social protection is purely a cost. They persist in the notion that when you want the poor to do something, you take something off them. But when you want the rich to do something, you give them more. What does it say about the Irish as a people? What does it say to people who are asked to contribute to the social security system in the future? That as soon as trouble comes, rather than rally round and protect each other, we will mark out welfare as the target for cuts. It is a folly and a short-sighted one at that. The Conservative consensus continues to insist that there is some kind of macroeconomic upside in basing adjustment on cuts rather than on revenue raising. It is a political argument dressed up as economics. It is an argument that utterly fails to understand the medium-term needs of a small open economy or the need for an adjustment to be economically, socially and politically sustainable. The elements of a growth strategy for an economy such as Ireland are not complicated in theory. The problem is that they take years to build up and they can be quickly eroded. The future of our economy depends on having a set of interlocking economic policies that promote the following. 1. Competitiveness in the short run and knowledge-based productivity growth in the long run. 2. A strategy for investment in infrastructure, in people and in knowledge. 3. An enterprise strategy that plays to our natural and accumulated comparative advantages. 4. A labour market strategy that fits the skills of our people to the needs of the economy and of society. 5. A functioning banking system that provides credit and supports entrepreneurs. And 6. Stability in the public finances and fair taxation. Throughout this crisis, we have seen an obsession in government with the banking system and the fiscal crisis, and no attention being paid in either the short term or the longer term to economic growth. We have had a lot of glossy guff about the smart economy, when what we actually need is a coherent job strategy that will translate into knowledge-based productivity growth in all sectors. There is no strategy in this budget or in the 4-year plan that meets these needs. Competitiveness is reduced to a low-wage strategy focused on a cut on the national minimum wage. The strategy for investment is an announcement about the Pension Reserve Fund being prepared to finance PPPs and is clearly not intended to be ever carried through. It's about more tax breaks. There is nothing on credit for small business and there is no labour market strategy worthy of that name. What the Conservative cheerleaders don't understand, or don't want to understand, is that this is a small island that cannot afford the social division that they seek to promote. We cannot afford to portion off a sector of our society and say that they don't matter. If we are to succeed as a people, we must harness the talents of all our people. It is not just morally right but economically necessary that no child is left behind. So why is it that the 4-year plan has imposed a cut on the Education Psychology Service? How can any minister come into this House and talk about the smart economy when the OECD tell us that the literacy standards of 15-year-olds have fallen from ranking 5th out of 61 countries to trailing in at 17th? In maths and science, Irish 15-year-olds have fallen from 17th to 26th place. And according to the same report, 1 in 5 15-year-olds do not have the maths or reading skills to participate fully in society or in future learning. Yet this Fianna Fáil government plans to take 1,200 teaching posts out of the system between now and 2014, the majority of which relate to disadvantaged children, traveller children, newcomer children, students doing a vocational leaving certificate. On top of this, the 150 extra teachers the Green Party claimed as a victory in their renewed programme for government last year are to be shelved. As a country, we like to tell ourselves that we have a great education system, and we do. But there are holes in it, holes that swallow up the life chances and the potential of too many children. You cannot build a smart economy in a society where children cannot read. Nor can you build a smart economy by placing further obstacles in the way of young people who already struggle to finish school or go on to further education. Obstacles like cutting the budget for programmes to prevent early school leaving by 5%. Obstacles like cutting the student grant and raising the student registration charge by a further €500. Obstacles like a €200 charge on a post-leaving cert course. This charge is like slapping a €200 toll on a pathway to further education that is used disproportionately by students who need a second chance. It's a false economy that will discourage people from participating in further education. As ever, what this Fianna Fáil Green government takes from the education budget, families will have to reach into their pockets to replace. €50 per primary school child just for getting the school bus, and €350 for a secondary school child. A cut in the day-to-day running costs of schools of €10 per child in an average sized school, that's another 2,000 shortfall parents are going to be asked to make up. Investment in education is not a drain on the exchequer, it's an investment in our collective future. This budget is based on a notion that somehow public expenditure in all its forms is the problem. Labour says that we must have reform of public spending. Labour says that we must have reform of how public expenditure is managed, but we also need to have a view of why we are spending the money in the first place. Our view is that public services, reformed and well managed, are a vital part of our strategy for economic recovery. In delivering on the strategic imperatives that I've outlined, and in providing the social glue that will keep us together as a people. That is why, rather than lurching from budget to budget and from one crude set of cuts to the next, we need a comprehensive spending review. Current spending does need to come down, but it needs to come down on the basis of a coherent multi-annual plan that has buy-in across government. In my speech to the House some weeks ago, I set a target of achieving at least a 3% reduction in non-social welfare spending each year for 3 years. Not a set of ad hoc cuts served up by a hired consultant, but a considered view of where expenditure matters and where it is less important. The approach favoured by Labour is a comprehensive spending review based on the Canadian model, where the goals and means of delivering each spending programme are reconsidered. The review should be based on the following objectives. 1. Prioritising education as the link to our future. 2. Maintaining frontline public services while reducing the cost base, particularly in the health service. 3. Maximising savings through efficiency and reform. And 4. Increasing public sector productivity by delivering the same or better services with fewer staff. Yeah, I appreciate that. Labour has said before, it is an absolute necessity that we achieve savings through reform, including the process of reducing numbers in the public service. After months of asking the government for figures, the 4-year plan finally gives some details of what can be achieved. The target reduction in the pay bill of €1.2 billion is not, in my view, sufficiently ambitious. We need to achieve at least €1.4 billion in savings in the period 2011 to 2013, including a reduction in numbers of some 15 to 20,000 through a combination of natural wastage and voluntary redundancies. Labour has also accepted that Ireland can no longer afford a capital programme that is greatly in excess of the European norm. But in bringing down the level of capital spending, we need to promote alternatives to the traditional exchequer support for capital projects through the establishment of a strategic investment bank. The proposal in the budget for greater involvement by the Pension Reserve Fund is the same empty promise that has been made year after year. Yesterday in the House we were treated to another display of the kind of falsehoods that Fianna Fáil like to peddle, especially when there's an election in the offing. The Taoiseach tried to tell us that Labour's tax proposals would hit hard-working families harder than Fianna Fáil. He tried again today by trying to invent tax proposals that the Labour Party never made and to attack those proposals in his contribution. Labour's tax proposals were largely centred on eliminating tax expenditures. How many average hard-working families have investment in property-based tax schemes that we said should be abolished? How many hard-working families have invested in car parks or hotels? How many hard-working families have huge pension pots, such as the ones that we said should have limits applied to them for the purposes of tax relief? Yet the Taoiseach decided to roll every proposal Labour made into one and to claim that ordinary families would be worse off as a result. Clearly, we're going to be treated to the same old Fianna Fáil distortions for the entire election campaign. In respect of taxation, there are a number of measures in the budget that are in line with Labour Party priorities. For years, Fianna Fáil scoffed at the idea that there was any money to be found in reducing tax expenditures. Now it would appear that they have discovered that they are wrong. They have made some modest changes that are welcome, but once again, the poor must pay now while the better off are given more time. It is necessary that we curtail tax relief for pensions, although Labour has a strategy that would be fairer and that would retain maximum incentive for people to save for pensions on an ongoing basis. While it is reasonable to have some phasing in of change in this area, the proposal in the 4-year plan to cut tax relief for pensions over 4 years makes no sense. All it is doing is encouraging people to take more money out of the economy in 2011 and 2012 rather than just getting on with needed reform. In last year's budget, the government signalled its intention to introduce a universal social charge, and the idea again featured in the 4-year plan as a medium-term objective. There is merit in this idea, since it provides for the simplification of a complex tax structure. It has to be pointed out, however, that the original idea of the universal social charge was to include PRSI, as well as the income levy and the health contribution, and to deal with the associated entitlement issues. The benchmark figure of a 7.5% charge in the recent ESRI study was based on a revenue-neutral change, including PRSI. It was in this context that Labour's proposal for a third rate of tax of 48% was framed, which would have meant a maximum income tax rate of 55%. This detailed work has not, however, been done, and PRSI has been excluded from the 7% universal social charge, while the PRSI ceiling has been abolished. This significantly changes the context for future reform. The Minister for Finance, in his speech to the House yesterday, wanted to rewrite history before he packs up his boxes for the new year. I'm afraid it is too late for that. History will judge Fianna Fáil for their destruction of the economy, of a good economy that they inherited. We've heard a lot today from the Taoiseach about the future. Labour believes that we will only solve our economic crisis if we pull together, if we provide a floor of social protection, if people can be sure that there is a reasonable health service, if we protect the family home, and if we keep our eyes fixed on the future and on a better life for our children. This budget has no such strategy. Once again, the future is put on hold as children are made to pay for the mistakes of the government. Labour passionately believes that as a country, our best days are still ahead of us. We believe that as a people, we can do a lot better. Labour believes that we can restore confidence, build enterprise, expand trade, train and educate our people, and create a stable and prosperous future. We can meet the aspiration that is deeply ingrained in the Irish people, that the future for our children will be better than today. This budget is the last act from the worst government in the history of the state. The next government will have hard decisions to make, but from here on, at least, we can begin to build the future.